On today's podcast for Inquiry, I speak with Noah Rasheta. Noah is a Buddhist teacher, lay minister, and author, as well as the host of the podcast Secular Buddhism. He teaches mindfulness and Buddhist philosophy online and in workshops all around the world. He works with others to make the world a better place as he studies, embodies, and teaches the fundamentals of Buddhist philosophy, integrating Buddhist teachings with modern science, humanism, and humor. He lives in Kamas, Utah, with his wife and 3 kids. In today's episode, we start by defining secular Buddhism and whether the secular descriptor is actually necessary. We draw some parallels between Buddhism and another philosophy that arose in Greece at about the same time, Stoicism. I read his book, Buddhism for Beginners, and asked him some questions about the book, starting with some points that I needed clarification and other aspects that I heartily agreed with. I bring you my conversation with Noah Rasheta. Welcome to the Podcast for Inquiry, brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada, a national educational charity supporting your community for reason, compassion, and secular humanist values. You have answers, we have questions. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood, board member and secular chair for CFIC. Welcome. Noah Rasheta, thank you for taking the time to speak with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you for having me.
I wanted to talk to you today about a subject that you're quite passionate about, and that's secular Buddhism. And I've taken a look at your website. I've read your No Nonsense Buddhism for Beginners book, and I've got lots of questions and comments for you. But before I get into all of my questions for you, I'd like to start so that everyone knows what we are talking about. What is secular Buddhism, and how does that differ from just Buddhism? What does the secular add to it?
Okay, that's a good question. So my approach to Buddhism, when I first encountered Buddhism, I was at a place in my life where I had no interest in any form of ism, and I liked some of the things that I had encountered from Buddhist thought, but I knew that I wasn't interested in Buddhism as a religion. And I encountered this movement called Secular Buddhism through Stephen Batchelor. He had a book called Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist, and it really piqued my interest. And I took an interest in Buddhism as a philosophy and became interested in explaining some of the core Buddhist concepts or ideas presented in a secular lens, meaning, here's this concept or this idea. How does this relate to everyday life for people like me who might be interested in learning about Buddhism without feeling like they were, going down the path of getting involved with an ideology or a religion. So I started presenting these ideas under that same name, Secular Buddhism. But I don't know that secular Buddhism is actually a thing. I think the more you learn about Buddhism and the more you understand that it's a non-theistic tradition, I think the less you start to feel like there's any kind of preaching or indoctrination trying to take place anyway. So I've kind of found that secular Buddhism is a way of presenting Buddhist ideas without triggering the preconceived notions or ideas that people might have about what Buddhism is. But I don't know that I would say that secular Buddhism is an actual thing beyond just talking about Buddhist concepts and ideas anyway, at least in my mind.
Okay, so that's interesting. I know that in Canada, and I've mentioned this a couple of weeks ago, or a few episodes ago, when speaking with someone else, we give religious organizations preferential treatment in our tax code, and one of the criteria for being considered a religion is that it has to contain within it some form of deistic worship. but also there is a specific exemption carved out for Buddhism. So you can be a Buddhist organization as far as the Canada Revenue Agency, that's the Canadian equivalent of the IRS, is concerned. A Buddhist organization, a Buddhist institution, is considered religious, even though it also acknowledges that it's non-theistic. Uh, so I kind of share. I align with how you described yourself before you came to Buddhism. Not particularly interested in isms or ideology, but very interested in ideas and modes of thought. So if I know that there are some strands of Buddhism that do have a form of God worship, or that there might be some supernatural, that you don't seem to adhere to that yourself. So in your version of Buddhism, which seems to be fairly predominant, would you consider Buddhism to be a religion, or would you consider it more of a philosophy, a perspective to take on how to live life? I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you would classify or describe Buddhism, not in its particulars yet, but sort of how you would classify it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question because it depends who you're asking, right? Somebody might say, well, of course it's a religion. If I look at it
I'm
on the
asking
list of
you.
religions, it's there, right? Um, and then, but for me personally, I like to view it as a philosophy, as a way of life. Um, but I mean, who am I to define what it is? I think that I'm not a spokesperson for Buddhism in the sense that that I could classify what it is, but I would certainly say that for how it makes sense to me and what I've learned through the years of studying Buddhism and practicing the concepts and ideas that Buddhism teaches, I would say that it's more of a philosophy than it is a religion, only in the sense that when you take the concepts or ideas that are taught, we'll call this the teachings. The moment you have the teachings that emerge in any kind of school of thought, you soon develop what I call the teachings about the teachings. And that to me is where like this notion of religion comes in. It's like, now we're going to take these notions and ideas and have notions and ideas about how and what those notions and ideas are. And now we've kind of we've moved to a new layer beyond what was the original teachings. And I think Buddhism for me is interesting in the sense that at its core, you do find these ideas of non-duality, non-attachment. So the very thought of defining what it is already takes you to a new level of what it was intended to be all along, which is an exercise in not being attached to the label of what it is. So I find that just to be one of the ironic little things about Buddhism. So I guess to get to your question, though, I would say it makes much more sense to me to look at it as a philosophy, as a way of life, as a set of tools to help me go about living my life more skillfully, rather than as a set of beliefs that I need to adhere to or believe in.
All right, I'd like to learn a little bit more about your journey towards Buddhism. So you mentioned that you were not interested in religious, like in a religion or in any kind of ism. You're not interested in ideology, by which I assume you mean you don't want to have to accept anything blindly, but to consider things and pick and choose what it is that you think is true and live by that. Let me know if I'm off the rails. I'm just trying to expand on what little you've
Sure.
said so far. Now, there's a whole world of ideas out there to pursue, and you're looking. You had certain criteria for things that you didn't want. Buddhism has clearly resonated deeply within you. You're a practitioner. You're passionate about it. You literally wrote a book about it, and it's something that is quite clearly central to your life. So, tell me about your journey from I don't know, quester, seeker, curious person with it can't be this, but I'm open to a lot of ideas. I'm assuming you looked at a range of of different philosophies, ways of thought, and so on, and you landed on Buddhism. Can you tell me about that journey and why it is Buddhism that resonates so deeply with you?
Yes. So growing up, I grew up in a an LDS household, Mormonism, as the predominant belief system and religion. And I had several hints or flavors of Catholicism from my mom's background and her upbringing. My mom is Mexican and Roman Catholic, and my dad was, I don't remember what he was. He was maybe Presbyterian, but when they met, they couldn't get married because he had been married before, so they couldn't get married in the Catholic Church. So that kind of set him on this path of looking for another faith tradition, and he landed on I want to say the Methodist for a little while, and that's where they got married. But it kind of left this curiosity for him. Well, fast forward to when my twin brother and I were 3 years old, my dad encountered Mormonism through a good friend of his, and that led him down the path of joining the Mormon Church. My mom wasn't very interested at first, but over time warmed up to the idea and also joined. So my upbringing was very much a typical LDS or Mormon upbringing. And one thing that emerged from this experience of growing up LDS, you kind of have a very firm foundation of here's what reality is. Here are the answers to life's big existential questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What happens when I die? I had the security of the belief that I have the truth in my life. And that guided my decision making and my way of living for years, from the age of 3 all the way till I was 24, 25. That kind of guided my worldview was the LDS or Mormon worldview. Now, what that did though is it gave me, like I said, the view or the belief that there is truth, and I happen to have that truth. And when I was 20, I don't remember the exact age, but 2010 was the year that I had a crisis of faith, where circumstances and life events caused me to start questioning the views that I had and the beliefs that I had. And that triggered the seeker mode inside of me, because I firmly believed that there is a truth and I had it, but now I was questioning whether or not mine was the correct truth. So I went immediately into the seeker mode to think, well, if this isn't the truth, I need to find what is the truth. Growing up, I was always interested in philosophy, always interested in history, and always interested in hearing and learning about religions. So I go into the seeker mode. I'm starting to question my own beliefs, and I start seeking out other views, other beliefs, with the intent of finding another truth that might feel more true than the truth that I thought resonated for me. So on this path of inquiry, I remember I'm taking my notes, and for me, it felt very easy. All I had to do was identify the core views of some of these other faith traditions, and if they resonate with me, then that might be an indication that they are more accurate or more true than the path that I'm on. So I'm taking my notes and I'm exploring other religions from the perspective of what are the answers to the existential questions, specifically who am I, why am I here, and what happens when I die. Well, on this path of inquiry, I'm getting a lot of answers. I'm just like, well, I don't know about this, and then I would encounter, from the. So I downloaded a lecture series from, what is it called? It's the Great Courses, and there was a lecture series called "The Meaning of Life," presented by the major world religions, and they had representatives to talk about the answers to life's big questions from the Christian perspective, the Jewish perspective, the Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. So the five major world religions. Well, when it got to the presenter who was answering these questions from the perspective of the Buddhist tradition, it stood out to me that right away he said, we don't have answers to these questions. What we do in our faith tradition is we reflect on the question itself. Who wants to know? Or why do you want to know? Where do these questions come from? Why do you feel that it's so important to have an answer to them? Things like that. And I remember dropping my little journal, that, my notepad, thinking, whoa, that was a big aha moment for me. I had never explored this uh, from that angle of where does the question come from, or who is the one that wants to know. And I remember specifically in that presentation, it was brought up that what you're seeking isn't the truth. What you're seeking is who is doing the seeking. In other words, who is the you that's wanting to know these things? And that was like I took in the Matrix, you take that pill and suddenly the world looks different to you. For me, that was that moment where I thought, I've never tackled it from this other end. Why do I want to know? Why am I looking for the truth? And that led me down the rabbit hole of wanting to understand. At first, I wasn't interested in Buddhism in the sense of, oh, then that might be the path I want. No, for me, it was, who thinks this way? Why have I never thought like this? What led this person to think, that the questions matter more than the answers? I want to know where that thinking comes from. And that's what took me down the path of studying
Yeah,
Buddhist philosophy.
that's one of the things that the Center for Inquiry Canada expounds or really supports is we don't want to tell people what to think. We are hoping to teach people how to think, and it seems like that's aligned with your journey. You started out just looking for answers. Tell me the answers. Tell me the answers. I'm looking for the right
Yes.
answers, and and Buddhism was saying, well, are you even asking the right questions? Reflect on the questions before you search for the answers, and that seemed to be the hook for you. Is that
Yes,
is that
very
a
much
fair
so.
synopsis?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, that's really interesting. When I was reading, I read your book, the No Nonsense Buddhism for beginners, and there's a parallel that I found, sort of a compare and contrast between Buddhism and Christianity, and I was hoping you could comment on it. And just to quote your book, you write, Buddhism teaches that greed, hatred, and ignorance are the sources of what we typically think of as evil. And these are greed, hatred, and ignorance are called the three poisons. And that got me thinking about Christianity's seven deadly sins: pride, greed, sloth, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony. I think that's the seven, and so the three versus the seven. So I mean, greed is right there. They're both agreed on greed. Agreed on greed. Hatred and wrath are very similar, but ignorance is nowhere to be found in the seven deadly sins, and the other five sins, as far as Christianity is concerned, gluttony, sloth, lust, envy, and pride, are not considered the source of evils or poisons in Buddhism. As someone who was raised in both a Christian and now are living by Buddhist principles, do you find that the different ways that these two approaches to life define evil or bad things to be different and to be reflected in the rest of the rest of the teachings?
I Yeah, I think that the perspective or the understanding of it is very different between the two traditions, mostly in the sense that from the Buddhist perspective, the idea of inherent evil or inherent good is almost, it's non-existent. Where in the Christian tradition, you have these external forces or external agents of ultimate goodness and bad, evil. And in the Buddhist tradition, you don't. You have what's called skillful means. So there's you can be skillful at something or less skillful at something, and that might be what's driving your actions. And that's where ignorance comes in as a poison. If I am ignorantly taught to believe that people who wear glasses are inferior to people who don't, now my ignorance may drive this view that I have that I am superior to you because you're wearing glasses and I'm wearing contacts, by the way, but pretending I don't. It would
Yeah.
be, my actions may be driven by the ignorance that I have in the view that I hold. Um, so it wouldn't be that there's an external agent acting upon me that causes me to do evil things. It would be ignorance at the root that's causing me to do these harmful things. Um, and I would add that's on a that's for the average everyday person. I don't know that that's the same thing that applies to someone struggling with like a psychopath or something on that level. I think that would be different. But I would also say even there, it's not an inherent evil. It's uh, a fundamental uh, what, yeah, I'm not sure how to word it, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is rather than having something as an external agent that's my scapegoat, like the devil made me do it, the Buddhist perspective would say, no, there is no devil. It's all in you. It's by you understanding yourself and your views and why you hold these views, you can be the agent that is minimizing harm in the world or causing more harm in the world to yourself and others. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it does. It's, uh, in Christianity, you're born in sin. So if you want to even have a hope of getting God's favor, you have to do good works, and different strands of Christianity define that differently. Whereas with Buddhism, there's just action, and you strive towards the wise or the right or the good, but it's not extrinsic or inherent. It's just that we're just people.
Right. Yes.
One of the things that I was struck, I read a little bit about Buddhism in my early 20s, and only really came back to it in preparation for this conversation with you. And one of the things that really struck me in reading your book were some very deep parallels between Buddhism and Stoicism. And I started learning about Stoicism about 5 or 6 years ago, and they both arose at about the same time, 2400, 2500 years ago in India for Buddhism, and in Greece for Stoicism. And I'll just read three. There's three passages in particular from your book that is, I'm sure, an accurate description of Buddhist principles, but could just as easily be in any of the Stoic texts that I've read. And that's unnecessary suffering we experience has more to do with how we see things than with what we see. And I mean, a core Stoic, that's just describing Buddhism, but a core Stoic principle is you can't control what happens outside of you. What is within your control is how you react to it. And that another quotation from your book: turning inward for understanding rather than acting on destructive impulses. And again, that's sort of centering the you have choices in how you react and how you choose to do things. Just because someone does something, even something horribly egregious, you still have control. You still have choices on what you do in response. And that's very important in Stoicism as well as within Buddhism. And you have to accept what it is you're feeling before you can do something about it. And I was really surprised to read that, because that really addresses one of the our current culture's misunderstandings about what Stoicism is about. The Stoic is someone who doesn't feel and just has no emotions, and that's not at all what the actual philosophy says. But you have to understand what your emotions are. If someone you love dies, of course you're going to feel sad, but if you choose to let that take over your life, then really it's almost like two deaths: death of the loved one and your own. And I'm curious, in your search for a new way to look at life, did you encounter Stoicism? Are you familiar with the parallels between the two? And is it something, if not, is that something that uh, you might be curious about?
Yes, I did. I'm fairly certain I encountered Stoicism as early as my high school years because I had a class in philosophy, but I don't know that it really stood out to me at the time. But studying Buddhism in more recent years and encountering Stoic philosophy and Stoic thoughts, I've definitely noticed the parallels, quite strong parallels, and I find it to be a fascinating thing that they're so similar in so many of their concepts and ideas. And I've actually used quotes or examples from Stoicism to help explain Buddhism or a Buddhist concept from time to time. Just another way of explaining something or helping to drive a message that you can find both in Stoicism or Buddhism.
What would you say are like the major differences between the two? Like, are you familiar enough with Stoicism to be able to say what the differences between these two worldviews are?
I'm not sure that I could say the differences. I haven't gone into Stoicism deep enough to know the what views, if any, are held, or um, so I'm not sure what the driving views that are, the deeper underlying views in Stoicism that lead to the views that they have. I'm not familiar at that level.
Okay. Um, I wanted to come back to uh, one of the uh, uh, one of the questions we touched on earlier. And early on in your book, you write, the question of theism, whether a god or gods exist, is quite frankly irrelevant in Buddhism. And I think that's one of the things that attracted you to it at the time. And I'd like for you to expand on that a little bit, because one of the three poisons is ignorance, also in Buddhism. And I'm trying to reconcile, if a God exists, that would be incredibly important to our understanding of the universe, right? If one does exist, or if multiple gods exist, and we go about our lives as though they didn't, then that would be, I think, an act of tremendous ignorance, and we want to avoid the poison of ignorance according to Buddhist principles. And yet, the question of theism is largely irrelevant, again, according to Buddhism. And that struck me as a little bit of a contradiction. So if is that knowledge essential to a right understanding or right wisdom in Buddhism? So can you help me resolve this seeming contradiction?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a good point to bring up because it does look like a seeming contradiction. Um, but from the Buddhist worldview, the deeper understanding would be to recognize that there are some things in life that are just not knowable. So to wrestle with wanting to know them, it's irrelevant because it's just not skillful because you can't know. And the question of ultimate reality, if there's a God or if there's not a God, or from the Buddhist tradition, these would be questions more like, is the universe finite? Is it infinite? Uh, Similar wrestling with those questions. The Buddha famously just never answered those questions. It's a notion called noble silence, and the idea was there was no point in even attempting to answer it because it's not answerable. And an analogy that's used often in Buddhism is the story of the blind man describing the elephant. And the idea
Yes.
is that you've got different people standing at different places trying to describe this ultimate reality, which is an elephant, but they're all describing it differently. One's saying, it feels like a trunk because they're wrapped around the leg. The other one's saying, no, it feels kind of like a snake because they're feeling the tail, and so on. The general idea of that story or that parallel is the understanding that None of them are completely incorrect, but none of them are correct either, because you can't have the full picture of it. Um, Now, sometimes when we hear that story today, we think, oh, okay, well, none of them got it right, but I can get it right because I can see, and I can see that it's a full elephant. But I don't think that was the moral of the story when it was being taught. The moral of the story is we are all blind in the sense that we can only interpret reality through the sense faculties that we have. I might be able to detect whatever the range of color that a human eye can detect. I would say
Yeah,
that's
that's
how many colors
it's a
exist.
tiny portion of the
Yeah.
electromagnetic spectrum, right?
Where some other creature may see, 4 to 5 times more colors than I see.
Or just an
So,
entirely non-over. You see
e-
this bit over here, another creature sees that
exactly.
bit over there. Maybe you overlap a little in the middle, or maybe you don't. You see things
Yes.
entirely differently.
Yes. So when it becomes a matter of this question of ignorance, is it to say, if I only see X amount of colors, am I ignorant that I don't see the others? No, the ignorance would be thinking that my interpretation of reality is the accurate one when there is no accurate interpretation, because there's there's only ever the ability to interpret it the way that I interpret it, but that will always be incomplete. The same way that for those blind men describing the elephant, no matter how they describe it, it's always incomplete. So when we take that idea and apply it to this bigger picture of, well, let's ask about the essence of reality. Is there a God? The answer from the Buddhist perspective would be like, for me to even answer that, I would be one of the blind men. I'd be missing the mark. My interpretation would be missing the mark. Now we see this even culturally, right? We've had, I don't know, thousands of religions, thousands of iterations of deities over the course of human existence. Uh, these would all be these blind interpretations of somebody trying to make sense of reality, which is something you can't fully make sense of. Do I need to wrestle with that and waste time trying to interpret if this person's description is accurate or not? Or can I sit with the idea that, hey, maybe this is just an unknowable thing and I don't need to concern myself with it, in the same way that if I were the blind man describing the elephant and for the life of me, I can't figure out why you're describing an aspect of it that makes zero sense to me because I'm over here feeling this other part of it. um, I I could say, okay, well, that's how it makes sense for you, and this is how it makes sense for me. But we're probably both missing, the big picture, because the big picture is something you can't ever fully have. That's the Buddhist
Right.
interpretation of reality.
The map is not the territory, and we can only see a portion of reality, I guess. And
Yes,
so, seeing only a portion, our maps are inherently incomplete, and
yes,
therefore, to some extent, inaccurate.
that's right.
Let me stay on this theme of ignorance, because for me, knowledge and ignorance are sort of crucial to what drives me, and what I'm trying to do. You write at one point that in Buddhism, not knowing, and that's in italics, is an ideal mental state. And I found that incongruous with most of the rest of your book, and so uh, uh, given the evil of ignorance, how can not knowing be an ideal mental state? That strikes me as you are both identifying ignorance as an evil, as undesirable, and exalting it as an ideal. And help me understand, because I could not make sense of that statement.
Sure. Uh, yeah, that's a good point, and I think I would clarify that this idea of not knowing. Let's imagine we have a spectrum of knowledge, and at one end of the spectrum, we're talking the knowledge of, well, if I go outside and it's cold and I'm not wearing a coat, now I know that if I do wear a coat, it's much easier to spend time outside. Like the realm of knowledge on the end of the spectrum of skillful knowledge, things that are knowable, things that are worth knowing, um, then yes, we seek to know things. But there's the other end of the spectrum of knowledge that I would say we start reaching the existential would be an example of. the things that are not knowable, that's where not knowing can be exalted as it's beneficial to not feel the need to know or wrestle with things that are not knowable. But in the realm of things that are knowable, it is skillful to know those things. Our knowledge of how physics and how things work, that's what's led us to where we are today, where we have, aircraft and amazing ways to travel around the world. But on the other end, there are things that aren't really worth trying to explore because they're just not knowable.
Okay, and so it's both. So it's knowing and accepting the limits of our knowledge
Yeah.
is a good thing. So it's not necessarily that not knowing is an ideal mental state as much as it is knowing that you don't know, or not being overconfident. Something that is likely is different than something that is certain, and knowing the difference. Okay, I think this is true versus I know this to be true, and having that, I guess, intellectual humility.
Yes.
Is that kind of what you're going with?
Yeah, I
Sorry,
think
what what you're
so.
aiming for
Yeah.
there?
Yeah. Or
Okay,
perhaps it's knowing in the sense of intellectual capability. Like, are we even capable of knowing things that we think that we could know? I think that might be one of the big questions that we should always have in mind and wrestle with, this idea that of what there is to be known in the universe. How capable are we in our species or with the human mind of knowing? How much can we know? In the same way that, just looking at ourselves in comparison to other species on this planet, if you think about, the intelligence of humans versus the intelligence of ants, we have those ranked differently. But why do we think that of what there is available to be known in a universe that's as big as the universe is, that we are ranked up here? What if we're the ants to some other species? Then when we're talking about concepts like knowing or knowledge, what if it's almost laughable that we're even thinking that we're anywhere in the realm of knowing anything? I think that line of thought is kind of what we need to have in mind in the Buddhist thought of notions like not knowing. It's knowing when it's appropriate to not know, that we might just not even be capable of knowing. Where are those lines? For some things, sure, it's knowledge is a great thing, but for other things, um, I don't know. It almost feels laughable that we would even try to know some of the things that we think we could try to know.
all right. Last question on this theme, and then we can move on to other topics. I want to quote another couple of sentences from you. And again, I liked a lot of what I read, but there were a few things I didn't understand, and this is one of them. You write that the wisdom of understanding is not about acquiring more knowledge. And then in the next paragraph, you continue. You say, unlearn the concepts and ideas that prevent us from seeing reality as it is. Now, I understand that makes sense to me for false or inaccurate or untrue beliefs, for these delusions, these false things that we have. But aren't concepts and ideas that help us see reality as it is the very definition of knowledge? It's like, if it's knowledge, then it's, accurate or true or helpful. So what I'm trying to understand here is, why is understanding not helped by actual knowledge?
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Um, Again, I think it depends on what it is we're talking about, and in this case, uh, Buddhist thought is centered around the understanding of suffering, the notion of suffering separated from pain. This is the suffering, or the feeling that arises when we want things to be other than how they are. So we're juggling these two realities. Here's how things are, and over here, here's how I think things should be, and we're wrestling with those two. Um, the thing that drives this reality, how things should be, is conditioned. There's usually a view. I think it should be this way because I believe, insert belief. So
Right.
in this sense, it's the exercise of understanding first my wants, here's how they are, here's how things are, here's how I want them to be, and next the beliefs driving the wants. I want it to be this way because I believe. Now I examine that belief, I examine that view. This is where unlearning becomes a key tool in the Buddhist practice, where I may recognize that this notion, this belief that I have, if I can unlearn that and say, well, where did this come from? Why do I believe this? I can unlearn that, then that will directly affect the correlation between my how things are and how I want things to be, which is, the key is that's the key to unlocking this idea of not suffering. So that's where unlearning is a useful skill, to decide which of my views are skillful and which are unskillful. It's
Right.
not to wipe out all views or all beliefs, because that's not even possible. But it is a helpful tool in the Buddhist framework to examine this experience I'm having of being alive and being conditioned by, whether it's societal views, religious views, all the things that condition me to be how I am. Some of these things I can unlearn, and through that unlearning, I ease or minimize the suffering that I'm experiencing. So that's where I'm coming from in that explanation there of unlearning.
Yeah. So this comes back. This is directly related to uh, the second noble truth in Buddhism, which is, and I'm paraphrasing now, but wanting life to be other than it is, and that is a cause of suffering, or at least it intensifies suffering. But the thing is, I'm an activist. I'm a secular activist. It's because I do want life. I want society. I focus my efforts on Canada, but I want Canada. I want the world. I want things to be other than what they are. And I put a lot of my time and effort into in working on things that I think are going to improve life, that are going to improve society, improve government. That's why I'm an activist. That's why I'm a part of the Center for Inquiry Canada. That's honestly why I host this podcast. So, is that am I contributing to my suffering? For me, this is a motivating force. It's a large part of my drive, but is my desire to make things better, and by better I do mean other than what they are. Um, uh, is this Am I living contrary to Buddhist principles? And I mean, I guess that's okay if I am. I don't proclaim to be a Buddhist, but am I living? Would I be a bad Buddhist because of my desire to make things better in the world?
Yeah. So, no. Well, first of all, we would say yes, that is contributing to your suffering, but there's not a problem with that, because suffering is something that will arise um, regardless. Because the first noble truth is the understanding that suffering is universal. It's in life there
Right.
will be suffering. So in this case, for you to have this view that you could be doing something to make the world better, but you don't want to, or you're like, I don't want to suffer about it, that's a whole nother kind of suffering. Or you could do it, and that suffering is what's driving this action on your part. Well, there's suffering there, but that could be also creating good. There's no way to escape the suffering, so you almost just have to choose your suffering. And in this case, it's like similar to you. I feel passion to talk about these topics and to talk about Buddhism and to explain these ideas, because it feels like this somebody could hear some of these ideas and it could help their life be better. And if I'm not doing this, I would be suffering. But I have an amount of suffering that I experience, which is what's driving me to talk about this, and but I recognize there's just no way around it in life. Wanting things to be other than how they are, that's just life. And if I want to not want things to be other than how they are, well, now I'm caught up in it. There's no way to not be caught in that. So I can try to be skillful with the suffering that I experience. And um, I do like to say it's a good thing that this happens. This suffering that we experience, this is why we drive around in vehicles now instead of walking around. because somebody was like, I'm tired of walking. There's got to be a better way. And that suffering leads to skillful action, which leads to, oh, someone invented, the wagon and then the car and now airplanes. That's what's driving all of that. So it's not that suffering is a bad thing, but there are aspects of suffering that are unnecessary because they're driven by unskillful views or unskillful beliefs. So I think that's at the heart of all of this, is recognizing you're going to suffer, but let's look at it. Why am I suffering? Or some aspects of my suffering might be driven by views and conditioning that's just not skillful, and some of it isn't. And knowing the difference between the two helps me to navigate this a little bit more skillfully, so I'm not caught up wasting my whole life wrestling with the suffering of things that were just I didn't need to be wrestling with. And then I can dedicate time to the things that do feel more skillful, like for you to do what you're doing. There's a reason why you're doing it. But yes, the reason, the suffering, that's the formula. That's why, yeah, you want things to be other than how they are. That's why you're doing your podcast. But the point isn't to eradicate that and say, I don't want anything to ever be other than how it is. It's like, well, that's not going to work either, because if you wait long enough, your body's going to say, hey, I need to eat. I need to drink water. As you drink water, right?
Yes,
And
indeed.
there's nothing wrong with that. But the reason that you're doing that is because you are wanting things to be other than how they are. Your body's like, hey, I need water, so it drinks. So that's not the problem. The problem isn't the wanting. The problem is the unskillful wanting that's causing unnecessary suffering.
Okay. I don't want you to think that I didn't understand anything in your book. There was a lot in what you wrote that resonated with me quite a bit. One example is you write that truths that are true whether we believe them or not, and you were contrasted with truths that are true simply because we believe they are true. And the example that you gave is that gold is more valuable than silver only because we collectively believe this to be so. And I hit upon this idea a little while ago when I was sort of contrasting, at least in my head. There are things that are true regardless of your personal belief. Like you want to believe that you can fly. Well, I mean, that's fine. But if you jump off a roof, like gravity is going to take you regardless. And then a couple of years ago, I read a couple of books by Yuval Noah Harari, and he articulated this thought better than I did mentally, and he said that there's a whole bunch of collective delusions that we embrace because they're useful, even though they're completely arbitrary. Things like money or national borders, even laws or human rights. These are all fictions. They're not at all true in the sense of physics, but they're useful fictions. And as long as we all agree to act as though they have enormous beneficial effects on our lives. And I was really quite surprised to realize that this is, I'm not even sure it was a new idea 2,500 years ago, but that this is part of the Buddhist canon. And I wanted to say that like this was, it was really interesting to read that this is part of Buddhist thought for 2.5 millennia. And I don't know if you have any comments on that or other things that may have struck you as surprisingly insightful so long after the ideas were first articulated.
Yeah, well, so this notion of truth for me, again, coming from an upbringing that there is an ultimate truth, and that truth, like whether you believe it or not, in my mind back then, I thought, well, it doesn't matter if you believe it or not. I believe that this is the ultimate truth, and therefore it's the ultimate truth. I was surprised to encounter in Buddhism the notion of two truths. In some schools of Buddhism, you have this notion of two truths: ultimate truth and relative truth. And my whole view of what it means for something to be true, it was like upended overnight through this understanding that relative truth, in other words, the truth that is relative to how I perceive things. Going back to the colors example, if I perceive light on a spectrum the way my eyes perceive light. I look at this light, and it may be true for me that green is green. So, but that's not an absolute truth, because somebody with a different set of senses, or a different creature with a different set of senses, may have a spectrum of light where what looks green to me, to them, they would call something else. It was fascinating to me, because it opened my mind to this idea that the things that feel so true to me suddenly aren't so firm. Maybe that's, maybe what I think of something when I think of truth isn't quite so firm. It isn't true based on how I understood truth to be. And so then it became, well, how, what fits in this category of ultimate truth? And I don't know. I think that's become a very, very difficult bucket to fill with anything, because everything that I've understood to be true to me now falls in this category of relative. Even physical truths, if you're talking about, the temperature of water freezing, or things that feel like, well, that's for sure true. Well, yeah, in this universe, under these, uh, the laws of this universe and this set of conditions, that's how that works. But put it in a different universe under different pressures or different things, and now you've got a different set of truths again. And it's just to remind me, like, wow, so many of the things that feel so solid and true are still relative. They're relative to how things are. But what if things aren't that way? That are those things true? And that's been a fun mental process to just see, well, what fits in this category versus this other category.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of a paper that Thomas Nagel, he's an American philosopher, he wrote, that the title of which is "What is it like to be a bat?" And the question that wrestles with is that, like, we're humans. We hear, we've got our five primary senses, but bats use echolocation, and that's just a completely different way of navigating the world. And we humans are, according to Nagel, essentially incapable, even in principle, of understanding. No description that we have of a bat is going to be accurate, at least from a bat's perspective.
Yes.
And maybe that's just a more modern take on a conundrum, or on a difficulty inherent in our existence that the Buddha came up with 2.5 millennia ago. I wanted to ask you about one other thing. You wrote on non-attachment, and you wrote that people might, if someone disagrees with you, they're attacking the idea, not us directly. And I read that. I had to put down the book, and I went, yes. I agree. No, I have been struggling, like from my late teens, so like literally for decades, with how to learn how I can dispute ideas, how I can disagree with something that somebody says, or at least challenge something, doing something other than just uncritically accepting something that someone says, without insulting the person who's proposing it. And I, I mean, this is something that Buddha had this insight 2.5, like a long time ago. And I'm struggling with, even today, if I agree with you, or if I disagree with you, how can I keep the disagreement in the realm of ideas over here, and not saying, you, Noah, are therefore a stupid or ignorant or vile person, even though this idea that you're proposing is something that I don't agree with. I'm not challenging or insulting you. And I mean, sometimes if it's central to a person's identity, if I say I don't agree with your faith, or like, if you disagree with the faith, you disagree, like that's a personal insult. I'm not sure that I can do anything about that. But even if, like, on any topic, I struggle with how I can have respectful disagreements, not ceding anything that, saying that I believe something that I don't, or that I agree with something that I don't. And obviously, if this is core, if this is central to Buddhism, this is something that's important to you. I'm going to assume, living in the United States, that the vast majority of people that you interact with are non-Buddhists. um, and so I'm wondering what has worked what has worked for you when you disagree with someone to keep the realm of uh, disagreement with ideas and insulting a person's dignity separate.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I feel like you hinted on this as you were talking. How somebody is going to interpret your disagreement with their view, if they are fused, their sense of identity is fused with their view. How they will take that and how they might be offended is kind of out of our control, right? But what I like to do when I'm talking to someone about anything, um, I try to continually remind myself that to view them in right view in the Buddhist lingo here, it would be to see you for what you really are, which is you are a bulk of the things that make you you. But at the core of all of that, there isn't a you that's like, aha, here you are, right? If I were to take a car and disassemble it into all of its parts and put it out in the parking lot, you can't go and bring me the car because there's no such thing as car. There's just all of the parts that make up a car. Then yeah, I have the car, but there's no such thing as the car outside of its parts. Well,
Right. Not only that, but the parts need to be assembled and connected in the right way.
yeah,
If you've got the carburetor over here and the wheels over there and the trunk in another place, and it's all you may have all of the pieces of a car, but if they're not put together in just the right way, you don't really have a car.
right.
In fact, you're missing one fuse or one piece, and you've got a 1 ton hunk of metal and plastic and rubber that
Yeah,
doesn't go anywhere. Like you really need the whole thing together for it to be in order for it to fulfill its intended purpose, which is to get people or things from place A to place B.
yep. So from the Buddhist perspective, this idea also applies to us as people, as humans. When I ask myself, who am I? If I were to take myself and break it up into all the things that make me, my personality, my genetics, my memories, my whatever, I can't take one of those things and be like, that's it. That's you. So when I'm interacting with someone else, I try to see that and recognize I'm talking to you, but really, who are you? What are you? There's no you at the core of all of this that I could be like, hey, that's who I'm disagreeing with. Aha, that's who I don't like. There's nothing there. What I could find is an idea, and this idea that we're both talking about and the way you're presenting it, I could be like, well, that makes no sense to me. So I disagree with your idea, but that doesn't mean I disagree with you because what is there that's the you to disagree with? Um, for me, it's helpful to try to, we talked about the five senses. From the Buddhist perspective, there's a sixth sense, or a sixth organ that does sensing, which is the mind. And the mind senses, or the mind is the one that perceives, and it's like the computer that's processing all the other sensory inputs. So I smell something, my nose did the smelling, but my mind is the one that's processing that experience, and it's attaching I like it or I don't like it, or neutral.
Right. Like, oh, that's my favorite food, or it's the smell of
Yes,
onions frying. I can't wait until dinner or something.
right. So in that sense, it's another sense organ. It's like the central computer sense organ. But knowing that when I do smell something, I don't have to personalize this and be deeply offended that this scent came across my nose, because it's not me that doesn't like the smell. It's not me that decides, hey, this smells bad. It's just it's what's happening. The way I'm configured and hardwired, I don't like this smell. And you might like the smell. So when we're sitting here and we're interacting and you're smelling it and saying this smells good and I'm saying no, this smells bad, I I don't have to attach the personal aspect to this of Noah is deeply offended, that Leslie likes this smell, and that says something about there's nothing there. It's just the experience that I'm having is different than yours. Um, And I think I try to take that and extend it all the way to the sense organ of the mind, and the mind deciding, well, here's a thought, and this thought resonates for me, and this makes sense. So this is my belief. And now, just politically, right? That here's my political view, and that's what makes sense to me. But that's still not who I am, and yours isn't who you are. So we may have completely opposing political views. And while we're engaging or talking about what those views are, I would never attach your view to you, as in you are, and then insert the blank, which is what we typically do. But I would interact with you saying, well, there's whatever you are, and then there's the view that you have, but they're not the same thing. So I can fundamentally disagree with and debate the idea that you're espousing, but that doesn't mean I'm disliking you or debating you. It's the idea. And I feel like when that's approached that way, you can kind of sense that I'm not attacking you. I don't dislike you. And if I'm trying to help you understand my view, it's not to tell you that my view is the correct one. I'm just trying to help you understand why I have the view that I
Yeah.
have. And all I want from you is to help me understand why you have the view that you have. But I'm already starting off with the point, with the position of there is no correct one, just like talking about the bat. Whose interpretation of reality is more correct, the bat's or mine? It's like, well, that's the wrong question. It's help me understand how a bat perceives reality. That's what I would do if we're talking about religion or politics or any of those topics as well. Help me understand why you view it the way that you view, rather than let me tell you why you're wrong.
Yeah, I this is kind of music to my ears because this is what I try and do. A couple of months ago, we released a bonus episode on Podcast for Inquiry where I was talking with someone about God's role in politics, and it was quite good in the sense that neither of us were pointing our finger, wagging our finger at the other, saying you're stupid and evil, but like, no, here's my considered opinion. Here's why I back it up. Here's why I think it's good broadly, not just in the narrow sense of for people like me. And I think my opponent, who I do think was mistaken in some of his beliefs, but also was engaged in a good faith conversation about how we can't just pretend that people of faith can just throw it to the side and pretend that it doesn't exist while they're engaged in public policy. So I was quite pleased to be a part of that, and I'm glad that it's good to know that perspective and that way of approaching even controversial or where there's not a consensus of opinion on something is more widely held than I thought. That's heartening to me. Okay, we've been talking for about an hour. I've got one more concept I want you to weigh in on, and then I think we'll call it a wrap. And you write in your book about how the me of now is not the me of yesterday or of 5 years ago or 5 years from now. And of course I agree with that. I consider that to be trivially true. But the me of right now is a lot closer to the me of yesterday than I am to the me of 5 years ago. And the me of 5 years ago was a lot closer to me than the me of 20 years ago. But of course, like I would be horrified if I was the same person that I was 5 years ago. I have learned, I have changed, I have grown, I've matured. And, the longer the time period, the more I have grown, learned, and changed and matured. And I'm hoping that process will continue so that, 3, 5, 7, 20 years from now, I will also be very different. But there's what I didn't get a sense of from that statement is that sense of gradation, right? Like I'm mostly me from yesterday.
Yeah.
I mean, over the course of the last 3 weeks or so, I've learned a lot more about Buddhism, and that's given me a lot to think about, and that will probably affect me. So, and I love this podcast for that. But I'm a lot closer to the me from yesterday than I am from the me of 5 years ago. So while it's technically true, I'm not the same person. To a first approximation, I am. And you didn't really delve into that any further in your book. So I'm hoping you can expand upon that concept as a parting gift to our listeners.
Yeah, great. So I think taking this concept as a whole is it's trying to espouse this idea that when I recognize that I'm continually changing, because that's the nature of reality, right? Is continual change.
Hmm.
The law of thermodynamics that energy doesn't cease to exist; it just changes. Um, for me, looking at this personally, with regard to who am I, there's a sense of freedom that arises when I recognize I can't pin that, I can't define it, because who I am is always changing. Now, it can happen very subtly, like you said, who I was yesterday and who I am today, very, very, very similar, but not the exact same. But sure, it might just be okay. A couple of dead skin cells and new ones. Like, where do I draw that line? How much has actually changed? But there are times where it could be a big radical shift. You get the phone call later tonight that a very close loved one is dying from cancer. You can bet that now the you prior to the call and the you after the call are now quite different. So again, to me, there's this sense of freedom that arises when I allow myself to know, hey, I'm always changing, which means I don't have to attach to who I am right now. I can be whoever I'm going to be as life continues to throw pieces at me. I always use this analogy that life is a lot like playing the game of Tetris, where pieces show up and we try to make the best of that piece while we have it and make it fit into the game. But then you've got another piece to deal with, and that's the nature of life. Is just life's always throwing things at you, and you're juggling them and sorting them and trying to make them fit just in time for the next thing to show up. So in that sense, the game is not static. It's always changing. And in that same way, I'm not static. I'm always changing. So knowing that I don't have to be completely attached to who I am, that tomorrow something might come my way that changes me, I can go with the flow and say, okay, well, let's see what life has in store and let's keep going about it the way that we're doing. And yeah, pretty similar yesterday to who I am today, and I'll probably be very similar tomorrow to who I am today. But at the same time, I know that that's just an assumption. I don't know what's actually coming my way. I don't know what
Right.
actually will change me and how much it will change me. But if and when it does, I'm not going to be completely anchored to, no, I am who I am today. Um,
Right. I always think of this way. I've got kids, and you see them every day, and they never grow overnight. I mean, sometimes it seems like they do, but they never grow overnight. Right? They're the same size in the morning as they were when you put them to bed the night before.
yeah,
But if a friend's children or a relative, if you haven't seen their kids for 6 months or a year, man, they've grown so much in that time. Even
uh-huh,
it's just by imperceptible degrees, day by day, but
yeah,
very noticeable uh, over a longer period of time.
yeah,
And is that concept sort of what you're also like? You do have those days where your life changes radically one day to the next. But
sure,
but
yeah,
for the most part, it's just very small, imperceptible day by day by day, but they accumulate. And so that over the course of 5 years, there's a significant difference
yeah.
from where you were before.
Yeah. Now, using that with kids, that's a great example. If you were to run into your relatives or friends, kids who have now changed from last time you saw them, and now you're really upset that, hey, man, last time I saw you, you were way into dinosaurs, and now you're not. You're different. That wouldn't be very skillful. You'd say, okay, well, back then you were into dinosaurs. Today you're not. What do you? I would want to know, what are you into now?
Right.
But and that makes perfect sense in that scenario. But with ourselves, I think sometimes we do that. Well, this is who I am. This is what I do. Um, and we forget that whether it's career, our relationships, our worldviews, all of these are aspects of how we are, but none of those are who we are. And what I do in my career is what I do. It's not who I am. But if I make the mistake of thinking it's who I am, then I'm not as flexible when life comes along and now I lost my job and I'm looking for a new career. Like I feel a lot of pain around, but I need to be who I am, and who I am is this, right? I'm a doctor
Right.
or I'm a whatever. So this is just again opening that flexibility curiosity almost, like, well, yeah, this is me right now, but I don't know what tomorrow brings. I don't know what 10 years brings. And I kind of like that. I think that's exciting.
It reminds me of a Ralph Waldo Emerson quotation: "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds." We need to be more expansive in our conception of who we are as people,
Yeah,
and
I
in
like
terms
that.
of identity. I like that. Um, Noah, Rasheta, thank you so much for talking with me today. I've really enjoyed our conversation. If any of our listeners want to learn more about you, or find out about, or to read your book, where can they find you online?
Well, the easiest place to find me is probably on secularbuddhism.com, where I have my podcast hosted. I also have links to the books that I've written and just some of the basic general information. Um, and what one thing I mentioned in the podcast that I like to mention it every time, and I'd like to mention it here. I always say, don't try to use what you learned from Buddhism to be a Buddhist. Use it to learn to be a better whatever you already are, because I do think there are gems of wisdom that emerge from this tradition, and you could find those and learn about those and add them to your toolkit of how you go about living your life. But don't approach it thinking that you don't need to be a Buddhist. Nobody needs to be a Buddhist. Nobody has to practice these things. In the same way that, like, exercise is something that's out there, but you don't have to do it. You don't have to go train for a marathon, but some people want to run, so they do. And uh, I think this is similar. Like, the practice of being introspective and getting to know yourself a little bit deeper. You don't have to do that, but you can, and it might be beneficial. And if you do, that's what the work that I'm doing, that's what it's all about. It's providing tools and concepts and ideas that assist in the process of getting to know the nature of your own mind. Um, but don't feel that I'm not trying to sell anything, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at here.
Sure. No, I
And
think your example is hilarious, because as this is released, I will have just run a marathon myself.
that's
So,
great.
but we will link to secularbuddhism.com in the show notes, so people that are curious can go there if the urge strikes. Noah, Rasheta, thank you again for speaking with me today on Podcast for Inquiry.
Thank you very much. This was very enjoyable. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode. Links for today's discussion can be found in the show notes. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please subscribe and engage in the conversation. Comment, rate, and review. Email us at podcast@centerforinquiry.ca. We'd love to hear your perspective. The Podcast for Inquiry is brought to you by the Centre for Inquiry Canada. We are a national educational charity supporting reason, compassion, and secular values. To our supporters, thank you. If you have not yet contributed, please consider making a donation at centerforinquiry.ca/donate, or becoming a member at centerforinquiry.ca/join. Your contribution supports our efforts to have rational and evidence-based decision-making everywhere. CFIC is on the web at centerforinquiry.ca. We are on Facebook, and follow us on Twitter at CFI Canada. Podcast for Inquiry is produced and edited by Lee Shields, Zach Dumont, and Martin Zielinski. Music by Anthony Lazaro. I'm your host, Leslie Rosenblood. See you next time.